And now, aviation weather around Alaska. Hello, I'm National Weather Service meteorologist Peter Chan with your Alaska aviation weather outlook coming up here for Tuesday and Wednesday. To set things up, we've had moisture come inland over the course of the weekend as that strong low continued to lift across the northern Bering now into eastern Russia. And by Tuesday morning, we still have some lingering moisture across areas of the interior and along the various mountains. So there will be areas of IFR early Tuesday, 40-mile gold country in the vicinity of Fairbanks, as well as the middle Yukon Valley, south central slopes of the Brooks Range all the way down to the lower Alaska Range. Panhandle area should see VFR, much of it, and that's going to be a trend for much of the upcoming week. It's going to turn windy and colder as a big area of high pressure builds over northwest Canada. This Arctic high will build up over 1050 millibars, and so the offshore flow of this colder Arctic air is going to really cool down the panhandle here for the next several days through at least the end of the upcoming week here. But back to the west, another strong low, but not as strong as the two that came up earlier this weekend and then last week. About a 970, 980 millibar low will cross the central Aleutians Tuesday night. So as we get into Tuesday afternoon, we find some lingering moisture up around the Alaska Range, causing some IFR conditions. Also along the Arctic coast, still some gusty winds, but not as strong as over the weekend and much of last week, but still some blowing snow possible there along the Arctic coast, reduced visibility as a result of that, and potentially some lower cloud cover and fog. But as we look to the west, this low lifting up across the central Aleutians has another front arcing out ahead of it, and that will spread IFR conditions all across much of the lower Bering and the St. Paul and down, especially on the Pacific side of the lower Alaska Peninsula. Into Wednesday morning, we find that the majority then of IFR conditions will be along the southwest coast, the Kuskokwim, Bristol Bay areas, lower Yukon, all the way up through St. Lawrence and the Bering Strait. Also areas around Kodiak Island and Shelikof Strait. Persistent area, though, of IFR will remain there in the eastern Arctic coast, especially from around Nuiqsut, Dead Horse, eastward through Kaktovik. But notice here in the interior, especially central eastern interior along Alcan border and much of the Panhandle, low pressure is going to pass up into British Columbia coast toward Vancouver Island, but with this high building in, it's really going to increase the winds, and the cold air is going to be able to come through the gaps, so there will be some stronger gap winds throughout this region, especially as we go through the midweek period, along with some much colder temperatures. By Wednesday afternoon, IFR conditions predominantly confined to the west-southwest coast, creeping up in a few areas here, the lower Yukon Basin, and also still a pocket of IFR expected up there around Barter Island, Kaktovik areas. So passes for Tuesday, Anaktuvik Pass, MVFR condition becoming VFR. Same thing, Adigan Pass, MVFR early becoming VFR. Lake Clark and Merrill will start out with IFR conditions early on Tuesday, then become VFR. And Rainy Pass, IFR to MVFR, same thing for Windy Pass. Generally MVFR conditions, but as you get up north of the north entrance, IFR conditions are anticipated there on the north side of the Alaska Range. Isabel, VFR conditions may be becoming MVFR, a little questionable as to exactly what will happen along the eastern portion of the Alaska Range. Mentasta Pass is looking to be MVFR, becoming IFR. And then as we drop down further south and west across the Copper River Basin, Tanita Pass, MVFR, becoming VFR during the day Tuesday, and Portage Pass, also MVFR to start early Tuesday, becoming VFR. And as I mentioned, much of the Panhandle will see VFR conditions coming up here for much of the week, but cold gap winds and colder temperatures. Chilkoot and White will see VFR conditions on Tuesday and beyond. Looking at the early morning temperature where we have the freezing line running, at least at the surface, extends out to the way to the western Aleutians up into the central Bering between St. Matthew, St. Paul, coming back in toward Bristol Bay and then along the Pacific side of the Alaska Peninsula, along the Kenai, northeastern Gulf Coast into the inner channels of the Panhandle. Freezing levels aloft do bump up as you get out here into the North Pacific south of the Aleutians because of that next area of low pressure that's going to be lifting northward. So ahead of it, we expect to see freezing levels increasing here up across the lower Bering, especially by the time we get into Wednesday, but 2, 4, 6,000 feet as the frontal system works its way north and northeastward. So the greatest threat for icing we will have from the remnant moisture that came in with the weekend storm. Still some isolated areas of moderate icing possible here in through the interior, surface to 10,000 feet with any of the thicker cloud cover and any patchy light snow that may remain, or just stubborn areas of lower cloud cover also out over the Gulf. But back here, you can clearly see with the frontal system that'll be lifting northward initially on Tuesday morning along and north of the Aleutians above 6,000 feet, and then as that spreads northeastward during the day, above 3,000 feet as you get out toward the central Bering and into the lower portion of the Alaska Peninsula. Upper level jet stream winds at 30,000 feet. We have a jet core of 150 knots from the northwest, just southwest there of the Gulf. And then back here toward the west, we also have a little jet max of 135 knots from the southwest, just south of the central and eastern Aleutians. So at 9,000 feet, 700 millibars, the belt of strongest winds is just south of the Aleutians and the Alaska Peninsula into the North Pacific eastward. We also have some stronger winds over eastern Russia, 45 knots or so. But as we bring it down to 3,000 feet, we find that some of the strongest winds first starting out here will south of Haida Gwaii and off of Vancouver Island, 50 plus knot winds out of the northwest, and then back to the west here. Here's that low circulation crossing up through the kind of more of the west central Aleutians, and around it we find winds anywhere from 40 to as high as pockets of 60 knot winds, and some of the strongest there extending out to near St. Paul and then south of the Aleutians. So this is going to translate to the best threat for moderate turbulence here along the Aleutian chain up into the tip here of the Alaska Peninsula, surface to 3,000 feet on Tuesday. There could also be, with northwest winds, some moderate turbulence there around the entrance of Cook Inlet, surface to 5,000 feet. And then in the far north, we could see some isolated moderate turbulence along Point Hope and also around Kaktovik in the far eastern portion of the Arctic coast from the surface to 3,000 feet.